A silent bobcat stood in the middle of the forest road, refusing to leave. It didn't growl, it didn't run, it just waited. Officer Maggie Dalton thought she was responding to another wildlife call until she saw the tracking beacon strapped to the bobcat's leg. That's when her heart sank. Somewhere deep in the pines, someone was missing, and the only one who knew where couldn't speak. The sky above Redwood Bluff, Oregon, had a strange stillness to it. That afternoon, a thin veil of ash clung to the treetops, remnants of a fire that had swept through the lower Cascade foothills 2 weeks prior. The wind was dry and warm, carrying the scent of scorched pine and old rain. Clouds hung low, swollen but uncertain, mirroring the way Officer Maggie Dalton had been feeling for months. Maggie, 35, had the lean build of someone who never stayed still for long. She moved with quiet precision, shoulders squared beneath the forest green uniform of the Redwood Bluff Sheriff's Department. Her auburn hair was tied back in a practical braid, a few strands clinging to her temple in the late summer heat. She was tall, about 5'9", with long limbs and calloused hands, the kind that held both rifles and rescue stretchers with equal ease. There was something slightly weary in her eyes, gray-green like riverstone eyes that had seen more loss than she'd ever speak of. Before becoming a law enforcement officer, Maggie had served 6 years as a wildland firefighter. The loss of her fiancé in a backburn collapse 3 years ago had changed her path. Since then, she'd carved out a quiet role in the Sheriff's Department Wilderness Patrol Lost Hikers Accident Response. She preferred the solitude, preferred not being asked how she was doing. That afternoon, she was retracing the eastern trailhead of the Burnt Ridge Loop, marking down hot spots where the fire had reignited fallen logs. It was routine. The trail was empty. The birds had not yet returned. Only the wind spoke. Then she saw it. Just up the slope, where a narrow deer trail crossed into the underbrush, something moved, a flash of tawny fur, almost soundless. Maggie froze. Her hand went instinctively to her sidearm, though she didn't draw. The animal stepped into view, and she blinked in disbelief. A bobcat small, maybe a year old. Its coat was mottled brown and gold, dusty from ash, with black tufted ears and sharp amber eyes that looked directly at her. It didn't bolt. Instead, it stood still, barely 10 feet away, its breath coming in quick little puffs. Its ribs showed faintly under its pelt, too lean, but it didn't look wild in the usual sense. There was no fear, no aggression, only focus. Maggie slowly crouched, resting on the balls of her feet. "Hey there," she murmured. "You lost." The bobcat blinked. Then, in a movement almost too quick to catch it, turned and darted off the trail just a few feet before pausing again, glancing back at her. What the hell? She stood and followed cautiously, hand still near her hip. The bobcat made no sound, but repeated the pattern move forward a bit. Stop, look back. Leading, Maggie's breath caught in her chest. She glanced at the GPS clipped to her vest. No reception. Typical. She clicked her shoulder mic. "Dispatch, this is Unit 12. I've got something strange. Possible wildlife issue at Sector 4B near Burnt Ridge. No immediate danger, but I'm going to follow up static." Then nothing. The bobcat turned once more and disappeared into a thicker clump of Douglas firs. Maggie cursed under her breath, but followed. Her boots sank into soft ash and leaf litter. The deeper she went, the quieter the world became. No birds, no insects, just the whisper of wind and her own breath. Then she saw them prints. Human prints. Barely visible, overlapping slightly with paw prints. Not old either. Maggie knelt to inspect them. They weren't booted tracks like a firefighter or a hiker would leave. These were worn sneaker soles, faded and uneven. Recent. Someone had been here, and the bobcat had led her to it. She stood quickly scanning the area. The bobcat was waiting again, sitting still beneath a burned-out cedar tree, its gaze unblinking. Maggie exhaled slowly, suddenly aware of the strange rhythm in her pulse. This wasn't normal. Animals didn't do this. She took out her notepad, scribbled a quick map reference, and clipped it back to her vest. "All right. Mystery cat," she said aloud more to herself than anything. "Let's see what you're trying to tell me." The forest deepened into a quiet cathedral of green. Officer Maggie Dalton moved with steady purpose, her boots crunching softly on pine needles and fallen ash. The strange Bobcat, young alert and undeniably focused, kept a loose, watchful distance ahead. It didn't flee, nor did it venture too far from her sight. Instead, it weaved through tree trunks like it had done this before. Maggie paused under a leaning Douglas fir, her attention caught by a glint on the bobcat's hind leg. She stepped forward slowly. The animal didn't react as she crouched and adjusted her angle. There, half buried in fur and grime, was a band of metal, worn and slightly bent, secured with faded fabric straps. Definitely not a standard wildlife tracker. Frowning, she pulled out her phone. No bars. Of course. She took a photo and tapped her comm dispatch. "This is Unit 12. I have a bobcat with what looks like a non-standard tracking device possible, tagging anomaly. Location is just past Sector 4B near Burnt Ridge Creek. No response from my GPS or mobile. Will attempt uplink again shortly." The radio crackled uselessly. She sighed, clipped it back, and took one more long look at the bobcat before turning around. It followed her at a short distance, quiet as shadow. Back near her cruiser, where a sliver of signal flickered on her phone. She dialed the one person who'd seen more wild animals up close than anyone in town. Elias Granger picked up after 2 rings. "Cascade Haven Granger. Eli, it's Maggie." A low hum. "What's gone feral now?" "Nothing's attacking anyone," she replied, leaning on the cruiser door. "But I've got a young bobcat with an odd tag strapped to its hind leg. It's not a collar, not one of yours, I'm guessing." "Describe it." "Metal plate, hand-etched numbers. Attached with fabric. Looks like field gear. Not wildlife." "Grade, the cat, doesn't act wild either. That's not one of ours," he confirmed after a pause. "Our trackers are neck-mounted, GPS-enabled, and all have Cascade Haven branding etched on the collar. You said hand-etched." "Yes, the numbers read EM9I824. "Where are you?" "Just off Burnt Ridge Loop. Eastern Slope, I'll be there in 25. Maggie stayed by the cruiser, scribbling quick notes in her field pad. The bobcat, undeterred by the engine or the voices, curled up on a flat rock about 10 feet away. Its body language was odd, calm, almost companionable. Not quite tame, but not like any wildcat she'd encountered before. She watched its chest rise and fall. Young, maybe a year. Fur dusty but healthy eyes, sharp movements, too deliberate to be lost. 25 minutes later, a dust-streaked white pickup pulled up beside her. The man who stepped out looked like he belonged to the forest more than any building, Dr. Elias Granger, in his worn field vest and hiking boots, crow's feet deep around sharp hazel eyes. Years of Army fieldwork followed by a quieter life at the Wildlife Center had left him with the no-nonsense calm of someone who had seen blood dry and still believed in patching wounds. With him came Leah Porter, a teen volunteer at the center. Leah was tall for her age, all limbs and freckles, dressed in canvas pants and a green cap pulled low over her curly brown hair. She didn't say much, she rarely did, but she had a gift with animals that even Elias respected. "Show me." Elias said. Maggie gestured toward the rock. The bobcat didn't move. "Well, I'll be damned," Elias muttered, squatting low. "That's Nova. You're sure?" "Positive. She's part of our half-wild reintroduction program, raised from a bottle but prepped for wilderness from 6 weeks old. We released her about 2 months ago for her final assessment. She shouldn't be anywhere near here. Is she chipped?" "Yes." Elias nodded. "But the tag on her leg isn't ours." Let me see. He moved slowly, not wanting to startle the animal. Nova stood but didn't run. She watched, body alert but not tense. Elias squinted at the tag, brushing dirt away. Yep, this isn't wildlife tech. Looks field-rigged. These numbers, EM9824, don't match any of our registry codes. Could it be from another research team? Maggie asked, possible but unlikely around here. We'd have been informed of any overlapping projects involving big cats. Leah spoke softly for the first time. Could someone have strapped it on after you released her? Elias's mouth tightened. That's what I'm worried about. He stood brushing off his knees. We need to get that tag checked properly. I'll take a photo and run it against the emergency registry. Maggie frowned. You think it's a distress beacon? Elias shrugged. It looks like it. But if it is, we need to know where it came from. These are usually registered by hikers or backcountry skiers. If Nova has one strapped to her leg, that means he didn't finish. The implication hovered unspoken. Leah glanced at Nova. Do you think she's here for a reason? I don't know, Elias replied. But I know animals don't do things like this without one. I'll file a preliminary report, Maggie said, and send the photo to our tech guy at the ranger station. He might recognize the model or the number format. I'll do the same. On my end, Elias said, we'll cross-check registries. Meanwhile, he looked down at Nova again. She was sitting now, tail curled around her legs, watching the humans quietly. I don't like coincidences, he muttered. The forest near Burnt Ridge was shifting from day into dusk, and the shadows grew long between the pine trunks. The air smelled of cooling ash, distant fir sap, and that undefinable edge of oncoming night. Maggie Dalton stood with one boot planted on a fallen log, scanning the tree line as Nova. The Bobcat paced slowly near the underbrush. Her movements calculated ears. Pivoting, Elias Granger stood beside her. Arms, crossed lips, pressed into a line of concern. That name from the radio, Caleb Turner. I remember him well. Tell me about him, Maggie said without taking her eyes off the forest. He was a quiet kid, kind eyes. 14, maybe 15 now. Lanky build, always wore a beat-up green hoodie, even in summer. Had a way with animals most adults couldn't manage. He spent one summer volunteering at Cascade, Haven, mucked stalls, cleaned wounds, asked questions like a scientist. What made him stand out? Elias's eyes softened. Nova. When we first brought her in, she was barely alive, eyes still, half-sealed ribs like wires. Most of the volunteers were afraid to touch her. Not Caleb. He sat with her for hours, whispered to her like she was a child. She bonded with him fast enough that we had to limit his time around her. She followed him like a shadow. And now she's back, Maggie murmured, with a strange tag strapped to her leg. Elias added, and acting more like a messenger than a wildcat. Maggie turned away from the trees. We need to notify the family just in case this is more than coincidence. Redwood Bluff was a small town, and everyone knew the Turner family. The old farmhouse sat just past the edge of town, its shingles patched by hand wind chimes clinking softly from the porch beam. When Maggie and Elias pulled into the driveway, the front door was already open. Rose Turner stood there like she'd been waiting all afternoon. She was a woman built of quiet steel, 72 years old, still tending her garden with bare hands and a pruning knife sharper than most kitchen blades. Her gray hair was swept back in a simple bun, and she wore a denim jacket over a faded flannel. Her eyes, sharp, ice blue, met Maggie's before a word was spoken. You're here about Caleb. Maggie nodded. We picked up part of a transmission from Station 6, something about a missing juvenile. Caleb's name came through. Rose stepped aside without a word. Inside the house smelled of lavender and wood smoke. A kettle hissed on the stove. He left early, she said, settling into a chair by the window. Took his old trail bag and a thermos. Left me a note, said he needed to check on something. Important. He's a good boy. Maggie. Doesn't sneak off like this. Not unless he's sure. Maggie glanced around. The living room was filled with photos, family portraits, snapshots of 2 children by a lake. One older boy with a tangle of brown curls, and a younger girl clutching a red scarf. On the mantel was a drawing of a fox done in crayon, signed Ellie, age 7. He ever talk about Rusty? Recently, Maggie asked Rose's expression flickered. He never stopped. He believed that Fox saved Ellie's life. Said he felt responsible for him somehow. Like Rusty would forget how to survive without checking in. Elias sat on the arm of the couch gently. Nova may have crossed his mind too. She's back. Rose raised an eyebrow. The Bobcat. She found us, Maggie said. Out near the ridge. She's wearing a tag that doesn't belong to our team or wildlife services. It looks like a homemade emergency marker, and she wouldn't leave us alone. Rose leaned forward, tension in her voice. You think Caleb gave it to her? We're not assuming anything, Elias said, but we're taking it seriously. Rose stood. Then, I'm coming with you. Maggie held up a hand. We'll find him, Rose. But we need to keep this coordinated. Let us follow Nova's lead. If Caleb's out there and trying to be found, he'll need calm voices and steady hands, not a search party trampling every trail. Rose's jaw tightened, but she nodded. Fine. But you call me the second you know something. Back near the ridge, the forest had dimmed into its evening palette of shadows, and quiet, Elias had returned to Cascade Haven to prepare a basic med kit and alert ranger stations. Leah Porter remained nearby, with the truck cataloging notes from the earlier sighting. Nova sat by a scorched tree stump, motionless. Maggie knelt beside her, offering a soft whistle. You know something, don't you, girl? Nova blinked slowly. Deputy Jordan Mays arrived on foot, slim, tan-skinned, with short black hair and a utility belt that still looked too clean. He was new to the department but had a quiet steadiness. Maggie respected. Elias filled me in, he said. Still no confirmed sightings. Nothing yet. But Nova hasn't tried to leave. Could be waiting. He suggested could be resting or watching. Maggie added. Jordan crouched near the Bobcat. She's not afraid of us. No, Maggie agreed. She's seen enough humans to choose when to trust them. Nova yawned, then stretched. Still, staying within a 10-foot radius. Her tail flicked once. The sky above them turned to silver dusk. Somewhere behind the ridge, an owl called, long and low. Maggie felt it again, that gnawing edge of instinct. This wasn't random. Something someone was connected to this moment, but they hadn't found the trail yet. She stood, slowly brushing the dirt from her knees. We wait, and tomorrow we follow where she leads. Morning broke cold and pale in the Cascade foothills, mist curling low along the forest floor, like breath held too long. Maggie Dalton zipped up her field jacket boots, crunching over mossy gravel, as she returned to the site where Nova had remained through the night. The Bobcat sat under a dead pine, her golden eyes half-lidded but alert. She hadn't moved far. Maggie wondered if she'd slept at all. Elias Granger arrived moments later, hauling a lightweight search pack over his shoulder. His khaki coat was streaked with dew, and his short beard carried the faint smell of coffee and cedar soap. Still no movement from her, he asked. She's waiting, Maggie replied. But not idly, Deputy Jordan. Mays joined them with a folded topographic map tucked under one arm. Station 6 pinged in. They're sending a backup team to sweep the western loop. No signs of Caleb so far. Maggie nodded eyes on Nova. Let's move. But no sudden noise. She'll show us what she needs us to see if we let her lead. Jordan raised an eyebrow. "We're trusting a Bobcat now." Elias gave a half-smile. "We trusted worse things in the Army. They packed light, basic medgear, radios, water and protein bars. The temperature hovered in the high 50s, but the cloud cover promised more rain by afternoon." Maggie kept her hand near her radio, but the signal grew patchy the deeper they went. Nova walked ahead at a steady pace, weaving between charred trees and clusters of fresh ferns. She didn't stray or backtrack. Her direction had purpose, and not once did she break her pace to hunt or explore. It was as if something beyond instinct compelled her. They followed her for nearly 2 miles. The terrain grew more difficult, and the signs of the old wildfire increased. Blackened trunks, scorched branches, patches of brittle ash that stuck to their boots like guilt. Then Nova stopped. They came upon a narrow ravine where the ground dipped suddenly between 2 fractured hills. The trees here had partially survived, and new growth pushed defiantly through the destruction. Maggie knelt, brushing aside leaves and ash. Her fingers touched fabric. A torn piece of canvas, faded olive green. Elias crouched beside her, eyes narrowing. "Backpack strap." He said, "Look here." Maggie leaned closer. Near the edge of the ravine, partially hidden beneath a fallen log, was a folded square of paper. Burned at the corners, the writing still legible. Elias read aloud, voice hushed. "If someone finds this, I'm okay, just need to get to Rusty. He was here. He ran when the smoke got bad. I think I saw him go west. I'm going to find him." Signed, Caleb. Maggie's heart caught. The handwriting was young but steady, scrawled in blue pen. "He was here," she said. "Not long ago." Jordan scanned the area. Still no boot prints, but this ravine could have shifted with rain runoff. Any scent markers would be gone. Elias stood slowly. He went west. "That means we're skirting the base of Hollow Ridge. That trail's barely cleared," Jordan said. "Most of it's overgrown." "That's exactly where a fox might hide," Elias replied. Nova had not moved from the edge of the ravine. She stared westward, body tense. "She wants to keep going," Maggie said. Jordan adjusted his pack. "Then so do we." They pressed deeper the trees, thickening light growing dim. Even though the sun had already risen, Maggie's legs ached from the incline, but Nova never slowed. She climbed ahead effortlessly, a streak of muscle and fur, only pausing to wait when they dropped too far behind. They passed a broken hunter's blind decades old, and the skeletal remains of an old ranger trail sign burned illegible. Elias made a note on the map. Suddenly, Nova halted again. She sniffed the air, ears rigid. Her tail twitched once Maggie raised a hand. They stopped. A sound, barely a whisper, came from ahead. A soft rustle, nothing more. But Nova turned her head toward them and blinked slowly. It wasn't alarm, it was acknowledgement. "She knows we're close," Elias murmured. But to what Jordan asked. Before anyone could answer, raindrops began to fall, slow, fat splashes on leaves and shoulders. The forest held its breath as if waiting for a decision. Nova took one more step forward and sat down. The rain had started as a quiet patter, but within an hour it became a drumming wall of water, thick and relentless. Trees swayed under the pressure, and the forest floor, already soft from ash and old runoff, turned to slick mud. Maggie Dalton squinted through the downpour, rain matting her auburn hair to her neck, her breath misting in the chilled air. Nova had darted ahead and disappeared into the thick brush. Minutes ago, her golden form swallowed by sheets of falling water. Beside Maggie, Dr. Elias Granger hunched over the map inside a waterproof sleeve, his glasses fogged and his fingers stiff with cold. The older man looked more worn than usual, his khaki jacket soaked and streaked with pine needles. Trail markers are washed out, he muttered. If we went more than 100 yards off the old ridge path, we've lost the line. We lost it, Maggie said flatly, brushing water from her brow. We've got no radio signal, no visual on Nova, and Jordan doubled back to signal the Rangers from higher ground. Elias nodded grimly. We stay put, she'll come back. She always did when she was young. They took shelter under a narrow rock overhang, barely enough to block the worst of the rain. Maggie sat against the stone, trying not to let frustration settle too deep. It was early afternoon, but the grayness made it feel closer to twilight. She pulled out her field notebook and stared at the torn fabric scrap they'd found earlier. Now, sealed in a plastic bag, Caleb had written that he was going west to find Rusty. Oh, but with no clear trail, and now without Nova, everything felt like groping through fog. Elias sat down beside her with a tired groan. You ever notice how nature waits to test you until you're already on your knees? Maggie gave a soft laugh. Yeah, same way loss shows up, right? When you think you've got something steady. Elias studied her for a moment. You've been quiet about him. She didn't ask who he meant. Grief's not a badge, she said eventually. It's something you tuck into your pocket and carry. Some days it weighs more. Some days it barely breathes. Before Elias could respond, they heard a rustle. Maggie stood fast, hand going to her sidearm, heart jumping until Nova emerged from the trees, moving low and fast, her fur soaked and flattened against her ribs. She held something in her mouth. It was fabric, bright blue and torn. Nova dropped the object at Maggie's feet, then sat and stared up her flanks, heaving with exertion. Maggie knelt. It's a child's poncho, she said, turning the item over, worn, ripped at the hem. This has been out here a while, but not too long. Still smells of shampoo. Elias leaned closer. Caleb's sister. She had one just like this. Maggie said, I saw the photo at Rose's house. The red scarf and this poncho. Ellie wore them both. Elias frowned. But why would it be here? Maggie looked at Nova. She didn't bring this by accident. She's trying to tell us something. Nova blinked slowly and turned toward the woods, tail flicking once, then twice. A signal. She wants us to follow. Back in town, a separate scene unfolded. Inside the Turner home, young Ellie Turner, just 9 years old, sat cross-legged on the floor of her bedroom, arms wrapped around a stuffed raccoon. Her long brown hair was slightly tangled and her cheeks red from crying, but her eyes wide, mossy green. Like Caleb's were fierce with certainty. I told you, she whispered to no one in particular. Nova won't leave him. Her grandmother, Rose, stood in the hallway, listening quietly. She wore her reading glasses, now held a cup of tea that had long gone cold. She watched Ellie with a mix of pride and deep worry. The child hadn't spoken to anyone but Nova's photo since Caleb had gone missing. But when the deputy came to update her on the field situation, Ellie had interrupted, calmly. She's not gone. Ellie said then, she's bringing something back, that's what she does. She remembers. Rose hadn't known what to make of it until the deputy called again, saying Nova had reappeared with a child's rain poncho. A match to the one Ellie used to wear when she followed her brother down to the lake. Now, Rose entered the room, setting the tea down beside the stuffed animals. He's going to be okay. Ellie didn't nod. She just looked out the window into the steady rain. I believe her, she said. I believe Nova knows how to find him. Maggie and Elias moved through the drenched woods behind Nova, who now moved slower, carefully picking her way along a faint incline. They came to a narrow gully where fallen branches lay in tangled heaps. The Bobcat stopped and sat again, looking toward a dense cluster of spruce. Maggie approached the brush line and saw another scrap of fabric, this one tangled in a low-hanging branch. She lifted it. Backpack webbing, same olive color. Same as the last one, Elias asked. Too torn to tell, Maggie replied, but her voice had lost its doubt. They didn't say it out loud, but a silent conclusion passed between them. Nova padded forward and looked back only once. Her eyes held something not animal and not quite human urgency and stillness. "She's circling something," Maggie whispered. "Not just leading anymore. She's protecting." They moved forward, slow. Careful steps, mud clinging to their boots. Somewhere beyond the trees something was waiting. The wind shifted, brushing through the pine canopy like a whisper of something buried. The rain had slowed to a stubborn drizzle, but the forest was still heavy with moisture. Everything smelled of earth and smoke and something deeper. Something unsettled. Nova's cries were sharp now. Not the occasional chuff of earlier, but insistent high-pitched slicing through the quiet. She darted back and forth near a patch of disturbed ground, her golden fur slicked tight to her frame, tail lashing like a metronome of alarm. Maggie Dalton broke into a run, her heart thudding against her ribs. "What is it?" she called, her boots skidding over the mossy incline. Nova didn't answer, of course, but she ran ahead, stopped abruptly, then spun around with a sharp, desperate yowl facing Maggie, then the ground, then Maggie again. By the time Dr. Elias Granger reached her, Maggie was already kneeling near the edge of a long, narrow fracture in the earth, barely wide enough to notice at first glance, but freshly split. Loose rocks and soil had collapsed inward, leaving a dark scar that stretched down into shadow. "A fissure," Elias said, catching his breath. From the slide, probably recent. Nova whined again, pacing tight circles at the edge of the break. Maggie leaned forward cautiously, her flashlight beam cutting through the mist. Below, maybe 10 feet down, movement caught her eye, a leg, then an arm. Then the shape of a boy curled up, covered in dirt and pine needles, unmoving at first, then shifting slightly. "Caleb," Maggie shouted. "It's Maggie Dalton. Can you hear me?" A few seconds passed, then a groggy voice. I hear you." Relief hit Maggie so hard she nearly slumped. "He's alive," she said. Nova crouched beside her, eyes locked on the shape below her, cries softening into low, anxious chirps. "There's something else," Maggie murmured, angling her light again. In his arms, a russet shape curled against the boy's chest, a narrow snout, black ears, a fox still and silent, but breathing. "Rusty," she whispered. "He found him." Elias crouched low beside her, brow tight. "Is he injured?" Ankle looks twisted. "He's conscious, but we'll need to go down." Maggie was already unfastening the rope from her pack. "Keep Nova back, I'm going." Elias didn't argue. Nova let out one last sharp cry as Maggie secured herself and began the slow, cautious descent into the break. The earth was soft here, unstable. Rocks shifted beneath her boots. She moved fast but careful, her light trained on Caleb's still form. When she finally reached the bottom, the air smelled damp and closed. She knelt beside him immediately. "Hey there, kid," she said softly. Caleb blinked, mud caked in his hair, his cheek pressed against the fox's warm body. "Nova found you." "She wouldn't stop screaming," Maggie replied. He gave a tired, lopsided smile and held Rusty tighter. The rain had stopped, but the sky still hung heavy with clouds. A gray hush settled over the woods as the ranger rescue crew lowered a stretcher into the fissure. Maggie stepped aside to give them space. Her hands muddy and scratched from the climb, but her eyes were calm. Caleb Turner, now bundled in a thermal wrap, clutched Rusty gently to his chest, refusing to let go, even as the paramedics worked around them. The fox didn't resist. He lay still, breathing steadily, eyes half closed but alert. His reddish fur was matted with soil. His left hind leg scraped raw, but he didn't flinch. It was as if he understood what this moment meant. He had been found, and that mattered more than the pain. "Let's move." "Slow," said Ranger Leslie Grant, one of the first responders. She was tall and lean, early 40s, with a weathered face and long blonde hair tied back under a dark green cap. Her voice was measured, calm, and unmistakably firm, the kind you listen to in emergencies. "We've got a lineup and an ATV waiting near the ridge. The boy goes first, then the fox. Then we double-check that slope." Maggie nodded. She'd worked with Leslie before back during a missing hiker search 2 summers ago. They had mutual respect, the unspoken kind that didn't require smiles or unnecessary words. As Caleb was lifted from the ravine, Nova paced in a tight arc at the edge. Her ears twitched with every motion, her golden eyes following the stretcher as it rose. When Caleb disappeared above, Nova stood still, poised like a statue carved from sun-dried flame. "She hasn't moved since Maggie went down," said Jordan Mays, watching her carefully, almost like she was guarding the whole time. Dr. Elias Granger stepped up beside him. His jacket was half unzipped now, revealing the Cascade Haven patch over his chest. He rubbed a hand over his beard and exhaled. "Not guarding, waiting." She knew what he meant to her. Once Caleb was safely above ground, the team began to lift Rusty in a specially adapted wildlife crate. The fox stirred as if waking from a trance, but didn't resist the gloved hands that guided him. Nova approached the edge and gave a soft warbling call. Not a cry, not a warning. It sounded like a farewell. Later that day, under a warm blanket in a triage tent near the ranger station, Caleb lay quietly on a stretcher. His ankle was elevated and freshly wrapped. Rusty dozed inside a nearby crate, tail curled under his chest. Across the clearing, Nova remained beside the open flap of the tent. Despite multiple attempts to move her to a safer enclosure, she refused to leave the perimeter. Every time a ranger or volunteer approached, she'd back away, only to return moments later, taking up the same post. "She's not going to leave," Maggie said, arms crossed. Her uniform was still damp, her hair pulled into a low ponytail. She looked tired but steady. "She'll stay until she knows he's okay." Elias replied, kneeling near Nova with a canteen of water she hadn't touched. "Some bonds can't be undone just because the danger passed." Across the field, townspeople began to gather as news spread through Redwood Bluff locals. With binoculars, flannel jackets, and wide-eyed children stood near the ranger tape, murmuring stories that grew in color with every telling. "That's the same Bobcat from last summer, isn't it? She led him to him just like a rescue dog would, I swear." She looked at me like she knew I was talking. Someone even placed a handmade sign against the edge of the clearing. "Thank you, Forest Guardian." Elias chuckled under his breath. "They've turned her into a legend already." "She earned it," Maggie replied simply. That evening, as the rescue efforts transitioned to cleanup, Kara Diaz, a wildlife biologist from the State Conservation Office, arrived to evaluate the situation. She was in her 30s, short and compact, with sharp brown eyes and a voice that cut straight to the point. "You're telling me a partially rehabilitated bobcat located a missing boy and stayed with him for over a day." "That's what happened," Maggie said, "and she's refusing to leave him. She's not being aggressive." Elias added quickly, "She's not pacing in distress, she's just staying close." Kara took notes with a digital stylus on a waterproof tablet. "We'll have to review her rewilding status. If she's bonded this strongly, she may not be a candidate for full release anymore." "That may not be a bad thing," Elias said carefully. "She could have value in another role." Kara looked up. "Ambassador Animal." "Exactly." Maggie nodded slowly. "Nova's already taught this town more about trust than 100 pamphlets ever could." Night fell, and the field cleared. The last ranger vehicle left near midnight, its headlights casting long shadows across the tent where Caleb slept. A lantern glowed beside his cot. Rusty stirred in his crate and gave a soft huff. Outside the tent, Nova stood beneath the moonlight facing the woods. For the first time since the rescue, she sat still, not watching, not waiting, just breathing. And behind her, where no one else saw the trees, rustled with something ancient and unseen, like the forest itself had acknowledged her. 3 months had passed since Nova had led them through fire and rain. The Cascade foothills, once scarred and sodden, had softened under the breath of spring. New growth curled from charred roots. Wildflowers pushed through the blackened earth. The forest, like the people of Redwood Bluff, had found a way to begin again. At the far edge of town, nestled in a clearing bordered by spruce and pine, stood the newly expanded Cascade Haven Wildlife Education Center. The once modest facility had been transformed into a hub of learning and quiet wonder. Children's laughter mixed with birdsong. The scent of cedar and fresh hay hung in the breeze. Nova now lived in a specially designed habitat at the heart of the center, half a forest, half sanctuary. She had grown leaner and stronger over the months, her coat sleek and golden, her movements graceful and precise, no longer quite wild, but never truly tame. Her role had changed, not confined, not displayed, but trusted. She was the first official ambassador of the Silent Bonds program. Each week, families and school groups from across the county visited the center to learn about the quiet connections that could form between humans and animals, ones not forged by ownership or control, but by respect, patience, and something older than words. Nova's enclosure had no cages, only low wooden barriers and tall glass panels that blended into the trees. She came and went as she pleased, within the wide range of her territory. But every evening, as the sun dipped low, she could be found walking slowly along the outer path of the enclosure, her own ritual, like a sentinel on familiar ground. Maggie Dalton stood at the gate, watching. She had traded her forest green patrol uniform for something less rigid cargo pants, a navy windbreaker embroidered with the Cascade Haven emblem. Her hair was still tied back, though she let the curls go free now. The forest had changed her too. After the rescue, she was asked to stay on, not just as a consultant, but as a full-time community liaison and education supervisor. At first, she hesitated, but then she saw Ellie. The little girl had taken to the center like it was her second home. Now, across the enclosure yard, Ellie Turner, barely 10, knelt in a circle of children, her ponytail bouncing as she told the story of the time my brother was saved by a bobcat. She spoke with wide eyes, her hands tracing the shape of the fissure the moment Nova returned with the rain poncho, the first cry that led Maggie to the broken ground. At her side sat Caleb Turner, his ankle fully healed, but his sense of responsibility stronger than ever. He wore a volunteer badge, now helped clean enclosures, guided tours, and when no one was watching, still read aloud near Nova's tree perch. Sometimes the bobcat listened. Sometimes she simply dozed in the sun. But she never stopped staying close. Caleb's bond with Rusty had deepened too. The fox, after a brief period of quarantine and care, now lived in a semi-wild enclosure near Nova's. Though more reclusive, he had allowed Caleb to enter his space without fear. Visitors rarely saw him, but when they did, it was usually with Caleb nearby, quiet and steady. That afternoon, a small press group had come to film a segment on the Silent Bonds program. One of them, Joan Lark, a reporter from the Oregon Wildlife Network, was tall and wiry, with a quick pen and quicker questions. She had short auburn hair and glasses perched on her nose, and a voice that had once narrated conservation documentaries for national broadcast. "So you're telling me," she asked, looking up from her notepad, "that the town once viewed this bobcat as a danger to be released, and now she's what? A guide, a teacher." Maggie smiled. "She's herself. We just started listening." Joan tilted her head. "And how did that change things?" "It made us quieter," Maggie replied. "More careful. and it reminded us that not everything wild wants to stay distant. Sometimes they meet us halfway. Across the enclosure, Nova emerged from the trees, stepping onto the gravel path with silent ease. She paused, sniffed the wind, and turned toward the edge where Ellie now stood with her class. The children gasped softly as Nova padded closer, then sat only a few feet from the glass ears. Forward, eyes calm. "She always comes at this time," Joan asked, scribbling furiously. Every evening, Maggie said, she never misses a sunset, as the sun broke through a curtain of clouds, casting gold through the trees. Ellie stepped forward and pressed her hand lightly to the glass. Nova mirrored the motion, one paw rising gently to rest on the opposite side. The moment held unscripted, unprompted, unmistakably real. From behind, Elias Granger joined them, his vest zipped halfway clipboard tucked under his arm. "She's stronger than she was," he said quietly, more confident. "But she still chooses the girl, and what about you?" "Granger," Joan asked. "What's next for you?" Elias shrugged. "I'm retiring." Joan blinked. "Really, from paperwork?" "Yes," he said, smiling wryly. "Not from this." He pointed toward the path where Nova still sat. "Some stories you don't write down, you just keep walking through them." That night, long after the guests had gone and the lights were dimmed, Nova remained in her spot at the edge of the forest path, ears flicking in the wind. Somewhere in the trees, an owl called out, and Nova answered not with sound, but with presence. Sometimes God sends help in the most unexpected forms: a whisper in the forest, a cry from a silent creature, a paw pressed gently against a glass wall. In a world that often rushes past what it doesn't understand, Nova reminded us that miracles don't always come with thunder or light. They come with stillness, with loyalty, with love that expects nothing in return. This story isn't just about a boy and a bobcat, it's about the invisible threads that connect all living things, and how even the wildest heart can carry the light of compassion. If you believe God still works through creation, through animals, through instincts, through silent bonds, then this story was meant for you. Let it remind you to pause, to listen, to believe. Leave a comment below and type "Amen" if you believe that animals can be messengers of hope. Don't forget to share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that they are never alone. Subscribe for more true stories of love, rescue, and the quiet miracles happening all around us. May God bless you, and may He keep your eyes open for the small wonders hiding in plain sight.